about this issue of impartiality in the context of the global news paradigm, because I think there are some really interesting things happening, or have been happening at least over the last few years, that have quite radically changed the dynamics of how we get our news, and in particular international news. There was historically, for a very long time, what we might call a kind of hegemony or dominance of, if you like, the global news agenda by leading Western news brands such as the BBC and CNN. These channels were amongst the first to start what are known as global or world focused, round the clock international news channels. By that I mean targeting an international audience, not just a national audience, and through the English language medium. But what's happened over the last couple of decades or so is that we've seen broadcasters from other regions of the world set up competitors to the BBC and CNN, and actually invest quite significantly in their own version of a rolling English language news channel that targets a broad international or global audience. Examples include Al Jazeera, which is based out of Qatar, and includes RT, which is based out of Moscow. There are many other smaller examples, such as Telesur, such as which broadcasts in the English language from the Latin American perspective. There is CCTV, which is the Chinese state English language news channel, Press TV, the Iranian one. So there's quite a wide variety of these now. But we're particularly interested in Al Jazeera and RT, not least because they have had quite a significant presence on the global news stage and quite significant investment by the Qatari royal family and the Russian state, respectively. So first, I just want to say a little bit about what we mean by impartiality. And in this country, the legal framework, or the kind of the broadcasting code used by the regulator to monitor and enforce this standard uses the term due impartiality. If we take just the word impartiality, what we essentially mean is not taking sides. Broadcasters are required, news broadcasters are required to present and report on issues and controversies in particular in a way that is balanced, to the extent that they are not trying to favor one particular account or side or of a conflict or controversy over another. The qualification due means that in practice, this is always going to be adequate or appropriate to the program's subject or nature, and it must take into account all sorts of contextual factors. The classic example here is if, for example, a broadcaster is covering a story to do with the ill effects of smoking, and the tobacco industry lobby has produced or funded some kind of pseudoscience that suggests actually this idea that smoking kills is a bit exaggerated and it's really not that bad for us after all, then obviously we wouldn't expect broadcasters to give that the voices of that industry lobby and that so-called pseudo scientific evidence an equal platform compared to evidence produced, through independent, rigorous scientific research. You can draw similar parallels with things like the climate crisis. And actually broadcasters have been caught out a little bit in this area in recent years, particularly the BBC, where they've been accused of giving a disproportionate platform to those who deny climate change or deny human-made climate change, which is clearly out of step with an almost universal mainstream scientific consensus. It does not mean that broadcasters have to give equal time to every given view or argument, or every facet of every argument has to be represented. The other thing is proportional to the degree to which a particular view is has public or traction or expert endorsement. An example here concerns the particular rules that govern broadcasting in elections, whereby the coverage given or the attention given to particular parties must be in some ways weighted according to both their previous performance in general elections and public polling. So it's not enough for the BBC to say simply, well, we're not going to cover the Liberal Democrats, or we're going to give the Liberal Democrats a very small proportion of coverage because they did very badly in the election 5 years ago. They will actually have to make, if the Liberal Democrats have increased their popularity in public polling since then the BBC is required to give them a kind of due attention in their election coverage. The other thing about due impartiality is it may be achieved over a series of programs. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one individual program has to be impartial in and of itself. But that doesn't really apply to news programs, and particularly not matters of what are known as political or industrial controversy. In those instances, a broadcaster has to demonstrate impartiality within any given program, and indeed within any given news report. Last thing I want to say about this is in relation to personal views. It is acceptable under due impartiality rules to present a kind of personal authored view in a factual program. You'd often see this in things like documentaries and certain current affairs documentaries in particular. But this has to be subject to the condition that alternative viewpoints are adequately represented in the program or a series of programs. So often you'll find, for example, the BBC Panorama will put forward quite a clearly articulated view or thesis about something that they think has gone badly wrong or they're trying to expose. So it won't typically a Panorama current affairs program won't look and feel like a kind of news report, because it would be clearly editorialized according to a perspective. But what is then incumbent on the producers of those programs is that they give an adequate platform to those who disagree with that thesis. They're usually the corporation or the institution or the organization that is the focus of the investigation, and they should be given a kind of a due right of reply to allegations that are made in the program. The other really important thing, though, is that the editorial slant must be clearly signaled at the outset of the program. Why do you think that's really important from the perspective of due impartiality? That if you're going to produce something that is editorialized and is dominated by a particular authored point of view, why do you think it's important that that slant must be clearly signaled at the outset? Any ideas?
I presume that it's to do with not misleading people, but giving people an idea of what your context where your ideas are coming from.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, one way of thinking of this is if we think of the kind of bias that takes place in a kind of authoritarian regime, like let's say like China or North Korea, or the kind of media bias associated with state-controlled media. One of the funny things about that kind of bias is it's quite easy to detect. So usually that kind of bias is not effective enough on its own to keep a kind of population in check. And so often what those kinds of authoritarian regimes have to resort to is all sorts of other kinds of repression and and force to keep their populations under control. So that might include, for example, imprisoning people who speak out against the regime. And the reason why that bias is not enough is because it's very, very visible. It's because, in a way, if you're watching the news in North Korea, you kind of know, or you're more likely to know, I should say, that what you're watching is the view and perspective of the Korean state or the North Korean leader. And a particular problem with impartiality comes when the viewer is led to believe that what they are watching is actually something that is balanced, that is independent, that is impartial. Because if you can manage to inflect a news broadcast with an editorial slant that is not visible to your audience, then it's likely to be more effective. This is what radical theorists such as Stephen Lukes, when he talked about the third dimension of power, were really, really concerned about in the potential for media in Western liberal societies to have this kind of invisible and in some ways more insidious power over the audience, precisely because it looks and feels like media that is free of corrupting influences, whether it be from the state or corporations or whatever else. So it's interesting that the Broadcasting Code, at least in the UK, puts particular emphasis on that point. Why do we need impartiality? Well, there's a whole kind of historical legacy here to do with what used to be seen as the particularly intrusive quality of television and radio as media technologies. The fact that they are typically consumed within the home. Nowadays they're consumed via your personal mobile phone. It's a much more it has a much more direct it's a much more direct form of messaging in many ways than, for example, newspapers, which traditionally were things that were kind of often picked up and read in pubs or salons or on the bus on the way to work, and it doesn't have that same kind of presence, if you like, within the private sphere of the home as the television does, or at least traditionally did, and the radio as well. The other reason used to be in the old days because of the limitation of spectrum. It meant that actually only a very small number of television broadcasters, for instance, could be licensed to avoid overcrowding the airwaves in ways that could cause all sorts of problems for emergency services, the military, etc. So the state got involved with licensing broadcasters, and because only a small number could be licensed in the old analog frequency spectrum, which was very, very narrow, it was decided that, well, it was almost a kind of natural monopoly or oligopoly, and therefore you had to have these rules in place to ensure that people were exposed to different perspectives, even if only a small number of providers, and they could only have a very small number of channels to choose from. And similarly, the limitations of the medium meant that news programs were relatively brief, that you could only cover a relatively small number of stories in a given news bulletin compared to what you could in a newspaper. And that meant there's less potential for audiences to kind of pick and choose the kind of news that really sort of spoke to them or was interest to them. So that placed a more heavier burden, if you like, on the actual broadcasters to make those sorts of decisions on behalf of audiences, to kind of filter out what they think is the most important news of the day. The other thing is, of course, because we had this, we've always had this kind of unregulated or self-regulated press, which has become in many Western democracies, particularly the UK, the sort of the epitome of freedom of speech. The fact that actually the idea of the state getting involved in what should be printed on a newspaper was always a kind of anathema to those sort of basic democratic principles of free speech. But broadcasting was seen as a counterweight to that. So it's long been recognized, for example, in this country, that newspapers do not necessarily represent the kind of full diversity of views and issues and perspectives that you might expect from a truly, if you like, independent press. And often what happens is very wealthy individuals buy up newspapers and tend to dominate public conversation as a result. And so broadcasting was seen as a potential counterweight to that, and impartiality in particular. And similarly, the high barriers to entry, the fact that it still today costs an awful lot of money to set up and run a rolling news channel. That means that very few organizations are capable of doing that. Even ITV failed miserably in set up and ran its 24-hour news channel and then had to close it down because it was losing so much money. Even Sky News loses money. So it's a very, very difficult industry and certainly doesn't allow for much in the way of competition. And finally, television in particular has always been a concern because of what's called this notion of the reality effect. The fact that unlike radio and television, really very little is left to the imagination of the viewer. And what they're seeing very often is live, sometimes live feeds, sometimes live videos, but even in recorded and scripted reports, the fact that you're seeing really kind of close up audio visual accounts of what is happening in a particular event or a particular issue gives you the sense that actually again what you're seeing is kind of that it's real, that it's fundamentally true and objective in some way. But of course, much as I was talking about before, that opens up the possibility of using language in a particular way, using shots in a particular way, using sound effects in a particular way, selecting sources in a particular way that can very subtly manipulate that reality or distort that reality. And that's why it was seen as potentially an extraordinarily powerful medium. And indeed, one of the limitations of impartiality as a doctrine is precisely to do with this problem of omission. The fact that, well, you can regulate broadcasters to an extent to ensure that they don't clearly and explicitly provide a kind of editorial slant in their news reporting, but that's really hard to do if you take when you take into account the power that the broadcaster has simply to ignore certain issues that are, that may be inconvenient or awkward for the powers that be, and only cover the issues and stories that are, in some ways conform to an acceptable ideological agenda. If you look at, for example, the BBC's coverage of the conflict in Syria compared with the level of coverage of the conflict in Yemen, it's incomparable, right? So there's been huge amounts of coverage of the Syrian conflict over the last decade or so, and comparably virtually nothing on the Yemeni conflict. And yet the Yemeni conflict is a conflict in which the UK is actively involved. Some might even call it a war that the UK is fighting by proxy. It supplies Saudis with a large proportion of its military equipment and weaponry that the Saudis are using to create what the UN has called a humanitarian catastrophe in many ways. And the other thing I think is a particular problem is the power of language. So the way in which certain groups, for example, are framed with particular words. The classic, example here is who gets to be a terrorist and who gets to be a freedom fighter. Who's a moderate, who's a radical or extremist. These questions are actually quite often quite complex and difficult, and I think overlay what people like Stuart Hall call this underlying struggle over meaning in news discourse. Here's an example. These are two quotes from BBC News anchors. One referring to the Syrian conflict, one referring to the Yemeni conflict. Have a quick read of those and tell me, what do you think are the differences, if any, of significance? Any ideas?
So it looks like the Syrian one, it's giving a sort of weekly update or a more frequent update, whereas the Yemeni one looks like some sort of a statement of, maybe the last year or even the last 5 years. So the Syrian one looks like it's being updated more frequently. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. That's a really good point, actually. I didn't even think of that. What about in the actual language, though? The kind of terminology, the referencing. Anything strike you as?
What I see is in the Syrian one, they showing who is taking part of it. So it's backed by Russia. So it's kind of showing you that like the different sides and with who you need to kind of agree with, or that's how I feel it. And also showing that they have target hospitals, so you feeling that that's so unfair and it shouldn't be happening. Plus they also saying that the British government is kind of it has like an observatory of human rights, and they are there, and I don't know, I just feel it that they put in different sides, while in the Yemen one, they are just saying this is happening and kind of, sorry, we can't do anything, and which doesn't show who is taking part of each side. And it shows that it's an humanitarian crisis, but we don't know how many people are dying and anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's interesting that routinely in news coverage, not just the BBC, I'm sure you'll find similar in reporting on Sky and ITV and others, that when reporting on the Syrian conflict, and in particular reporting on the the different sides of the Syrian conflict, reference is often made to the kind of major world power that is behind the, if you like, the state, right, of Syria. You know, the government, the incumbent government. So the incumbent government of Syria is backed by Russia, but you will very rarely, if ever, hear news anchors on the BBC and others refer to the Yemeni government as Saudi or UK backed. So the closest thing you have in the second example is the internationally recognized government. It doesn't say that actually this government is being actively supported in its war effort by both the Saudi and British states. And I think you're absolutely right. The only reference in any of this to British involvement is the British-based Syrian Observatory, as if, you know, the UK simply plays this very kind of passive, neutral role in these conflicts that is devoted to documenting atrocities. Okay. Bagdikian talked about.
Sorry, I have a question about that. So do you think Yemen, conflict of Yemen, that I only find information obviously in internet and different platforms, because it's not really something that people talks about in the news. So they not showing it mostly here in the BBC, because they don't want to disturb the posture of the government trying to help financially Yemen. So do you think this kind of pressure to not say that, or they just not doing it for not disturbing, or what's exactly relation with the BBC, for example?
Yeah, I mean, you ask a very good, important and difficult question, which is why are these sorts of anomalies observed in the coverage of different conflicts? I can't give you any kind of categorical answer, but what I will say is that certainly if you look at some of the sociological studies of newsrooms in countries like the UK, what you find is that very rarely that journalists are kind of told, if you like, either by their editors or indeed by you know, powerful sources within the government or the state, you know, oh, don't say it like that, don't report it like that, or don't report this, or there is something in this country called the DNotice Advisory Committee, which advises newspapers on what to avoid in their coverage of issues that may pose a risk to national security or to the lives of British military or intelligence personnel. But that is very, very different to the kind of censorship, kind of imposed censorship that you might find in more authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China. So what that leaves us with, well, if you don't have this kind of direct intervention to control news narratives, how is it that they end up having these sorts of omissions and these kinds of very subtle ways in which language does inflect the coverage with some kind of editorial slant? And I think probably the best answer to that is maybe more to do with what's sometimes known as self-censorship, which can often be entirely unconscious. And it may simply be that journalists and editors simply don't have the time and the space to be able to actually kind of reflect on how they are using language in these particular circumstances, that their dependence on the British government as sources for their coverage of international conflicts is so great that they just become accustomed to a particular worldview lens, if you like, that says, well, Syria is the story, Syria is the headline. Yemen is somehow not, the story is not important because the British government isn't talking about it, because MPs aren't talking about it as much in Parliament. So there are all sorts of ways, I think, in which these sorts of very subtle forms of self-censorship can develop. That's not to say that that it's never the case that there are more kind of explicit instructions about avoiding certain topics or issues or pressure that is applied. It's just not that routine, and it's not the kind of thing that really characterizes day-to-day newsroom culture in this country. Ben Bagdikian talked about this as the power to treat subjects accurately but briefly, others accurately but in depth, whilst carefully avoiding some, enthusiastically pursuing others. So we have to really think beyond questions of whether or not a particular report is accurate or impartial, but think about what else could have been reported, or how differently could this have been reported. Here's another example from the banking crisis, covered by the BBC's Today programme in a study done by Mike Berry in 2012. What Mike Berry found was that after the financial collapse in 2010, the British government, along with others in much of the world, was faced with this immediate policy decision on whether or not to bail out the banks. And that turns out that decision would have huge consequences, and particularly for the public finances and the kind of decade of austerity measures that followed. But what Mike Berry showed in his research was that at the time, there was a debate among experts as to, whether the government should offer a bailout, and really quite significant voices opting for alternatives, including nationalization of the banks. Quite prominent economists, including people like Joseph Stiglitz, who's former head of the World Bank, and a Nobel Prize winning economist. And yet these kinds of alternatives to the bailout option were virtually entirely excluded from the BBC's coverage. And when Mike Berry, in asking this question, that Andrea asked, which is why what was there this omission? He looked at sources and he found that actually overwhelmingly the BBC was relying on sources from the financial, who were working within the financial sector. So comparatively little, for example, from academic experts, from non-BBC journalists, and even from politicians. So it's not hard to see why the option of nationalisation is unlikely to be favoured by people actually working within the banks and industries that could be nationalised or could be subject to that. So that's an example, again, of how impartiality can be quite severely constrained when it comes to the selection of issues to cover, such as whether, nationalisation versus bailout, and related to that, the selection of sources to draw on. Here's another example of the Iraq War, which shows how the media in the United States overwhelmingly drew on pro-war sources compared to those who were against the war. And this was, this preceded what was a very famous front page apology by the New York Times in 2004, where they in no uncertain terms acknowledged that they got it completely wrong, that they didn't scrutinize the government's case for war as they should have, that they acted more like stenographers for the government than journalists speaking truth to power. And so that's a kind of very clear example, again, of how sourcing can both reflect imbalances in the news coverage and potentially be a cause of them. This is an example from a study I was involved with in the BBC and ITV's coverage of the leadership crisis in the Labour Party that followed the EU referendum in 2016. And you can see, again, the dominance of sources who were critical of the Labour leadership compared to those who were supportive, particularly in BBC news coverage. The other thing I've talked about the issue of labelling in language, moderate, hard, or extreme. What do we base this on? Is it public opinion? Is it expert consensus? Is it common sense? It's very, very hard to provide definitive answers to these questions. But what is clear is that we as students, as academics, and potentially as activists, should be asking critical questions all the time as to why it is that, for example, certain types of political actors are routinely labelled as moderates and others extreme or radical or hardline.